Hello, and welcome to Skincare Confidential, a podcast dedicated to the insider information in the skincare industry. It is also meant to support the Science of Skincare Summit, an annual educational summit being held this year, 2023, September 21st through the 23rd in beautiful Austin, Texas. My name is Dr. Ted Lane. I am a board-certified dermatologist. I'm a co-founder of the Science of Skincare Summit, and I'm also your co-host today. But more importantly, today we have an amazing guest, someone for all you skincare nerds out there, especially for those of you who are in the dermatologic field. You will know Dr. David Osborne's name. Dr. Osborne is a master formulator. And we're going to talk about a couple of the medications that he has formulated, which are really unbelievable, including one called Zoryve that we have now for psoriasis. Dr. Osborne was educated at the University of Missouri in Rolla, Missouri. He's got a PhD from that program, as well as an honorary professional degree in chemistry. He received his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Southwest Missouri State. He is currently the Chief Technical Officer for Arcutis since 2017. And before that, he has been involved in many other formulating roles with different companies. He also has his own consulting company, David W. Osborne PhD Consulting. So for anybody out there who needs some help with your formulations, reach out to Dr. Osborne. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ted. I really appreciate the invite and looking forward to the next half hour or so.
Great. Well, this is definitely a kind of a different path for us in this podcast, because now we really are focused on using medical topical formulations as both treatments as well as skincare. And I think once we get through what David has used to formulate, you'll understand why. So David, just give us some background. Why did you get into this field? What about formulating topical medications was appealing to you?
Yeah, so it really started when I began my PhD program at the University of Missouri-Rolla, and that I happened to have a graduate advisor who at that time in 1982 had won a number of awards for cosmetic chemistry. He had, in the late 70s, he had discovered what stabilized emulsions, and these were cosmetic emulsions, and he was well renowned throughout the world for that. So when I signed on, my dissertation was how a skin softener interacts with the lipids in the stratum corneum.
Got it. And I guess the rest is history, because honestly, without Dr. Osborne, I don't know that we would have topical dapsone, for example.
Yeah, probably not. And, the doctor stuff, we can do away with the Dr. Osborne. So
okay,
please
we'll
just call me David
from now on. Gotcha. All right. Well, let's start with that. Okay. Because I think that the topical dapsone, which was Axone back in the day, and now it's generic, of course, but that was pretty revolutionary. Nobody else could really figure out how to put dapsone into a topical formulation, but you decided to use kind of a novel penetration enhancer called transcutol. Can you go through that with us?
Absolutely. So, it's interesting. So transcutol as a solvent for personal care products was used a lot in the 80s and early 90s as in the sunless tan products, So the tan in a bottle, a lot of those were about 40% transcutol because it was a solvent that prevented streaking. In the early days, and I never remember DHA, the dihydroxyacetone. It would just streak, and then you'd have these striations in color as the active bonded to the stratum corneum, and they fixed that with transcutol. So really early, when I was first at Viratex down in the Woodlands, Texas,
Mm-hmm.
Just a little south of you, away from the Yankees up here. The uh, the uh, uh, the sales rep from Gafosay brought me a sample of Transcutol, and I formulated an over-the-counter cold sore product, a gel, Viractin gel, with Transcutol.
Wow.
So then when it came time, if a person can, put 40% Transcutol covering their entire legs and arms and torso, I figured I could treat a cold sore with it
Mm-hmm.
safely, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we launched that product. It was really, over the counter. Tetracaine was the active, nothing extraordinary except that it used a novel solvent. So when it came time to try to formulate Dapsone, it was on the shelf, and it turned out to be an amazing solvent for Dapsone. That was the key.
Because prior to that, right, Dapsone, we just didn't have the ability to really have a solvent for Dapsone. We couldn't dissolve it in anything to make it a topical
That's
that
right.
worked well.
Yeah, and Dapsone is a fascinating drug. It's like a magic trick. It's like a party trick for a kid's birthday party or something. You can have like a scintillation vial full of the powdered drug Dapsone, and you add 10 drops of Transcutol, it all melts away.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And Dapsone kind of lends itself to acne. Honestly, it's antimicrobial as well as anti-inflammatory. But there's something special with Transcutol as well, David. I think I was reading in an article published a long time ago that it almost acts as to form a reservoir effect in the stratum corneum, and it limits systemic exposure as well.
It does, and Transcutol, when you because I wrote this review article when I retired from Tolmar, although I was working on roflumilast kind of concurrent with retirement. But a luxury a gift I gave myself was I reviewed all the Transcutol literature, because there was this I don't know, schizophrenia, if you will, in the literature, because on one hand you'd say, Transcutol enhanced delivery 200-fold, and then the next paper would say, it forms this depot in the stratum corneum, and so the drug was sustained release, topical sustained release technology, and it never, in my hands, it was great solvent. It was really good at being able to deliver drugs that couldn't be dissolved in other formulations. But I never saw it as this major enhancer. I never really saw it just, pound stuff through the stratum corneum like DMSO does. Right? Mm-hmm. We understand DMSO. And so in that review article, it really depends on other things in the formulation, because you're not going to get a tremendous amount of penetration enhancement unless you have other things like, propylene glycol.
So it's interesting you say propylene glycol, right? Because we have seen formulations with very high percentages of propylene glycol to enhance penetration. Now, the downside of that is irritation.
That's right. And some people are allergic, or they have some sort of special sensitivity to propylene glycol, and it just lights them up. I'm one of those people, by the way. So I don't tend to formulate. I did a lot of work with Rogaine back in the 80s, my first job. So I exposed myself to a lot of propylene glycol. Somewhere in the mid-90s, I just couldn't use products that contain propylene glycol. And so, if you're a formulator and you're trying the 20 prototype formulations all day long, if I had used propylene glycol for Zarif, for example, back of my hands would have been raw within 2 days of development. So I don't use propylene glycol personally, so I don't formulate with it just because I can't tolerate it.
But it has been used at higher concentrations in order to enhance penetration.
Oh, absolutely,
And I believe I think you were involved in this, the formulation of a novel clobetasol topical with transcutol instead of propylene glycol. Am I right about that?
Yeah, Clobex spray. I
Mm-hmm.
did not formulate Clobex spray, but I was at Dow Pharmaceutical Sciences when that product was under development. So I wrote most of the CMC sections, defended it with the FDA,
Yeah.
yeah, worked a lot with Clobex.
Oh man, and I remember when Clobex came out, it really changed the way we treated psoriasis because it was one of those sprays you're supposed to still rub it in a little bit, but it really was such a great product. You
Yeah,
know, it's funny how the industry goes, right? You formulate, you formulate, you formulate, you get these new formulations of these older compounds and they work better. And then now we're trying to move away from steroids altogether, aren't we?
we are because we have safer alternatives, and
Right.
both Zoryve and Vtama are
Uh-huh.
great non-steroidals. I mean, I don't know how you've found it in your practice, but um, they're doing a lot of good for a lot of people.
Yeah. So sorry, I almost said doctor again. What David is referring to is so he helped to formulate roflumilast, which is a PDE4 inhibitor, phosphodiesterase 4 inhibitor, which is an intracellular enzyme responsible for inflammation, essentially. And by inhibiting it, it's shown to help reduce the severity of psoriasis and also in starting to show it in eczema as well. Um, and so roflumilast is a PDE4 inhibitor. Right now, we are in dermatology. We're very familiar with PDE4 inhibitors, with both with apremilast and with crisaborole. Apremilast being the essentially the systemic agent PDE4, and crisaborole being the topical. And now we have the new PDE4 inhibitor, which is roflumilast. And that, although it contains transcutol, there's another chemical, there's another compound in there that is kind of revolutionary in terms of how it's being used in medicine, right? Right, David?
Yeah, the emulsifier is a emulsifying wax blend with the trade name Crotophos CES.
Okay.
Now, Crotophos CES has been around. It was launched by Crota in the 90s and it's used extensively in the you know um, physical blocker sunscreens, the titanium
Mm.
dioxide, and those sorts of sunscreens.
Why in those? Why was it used there?
Uh, it makes a wonderfully stable emulsion.
Okay.
If you have a cream in a tube that you have with you on the beach and it gets heated up to 110 degrees, or you leave it in the car, you don't want it phase separating. And Crotophos, uh, you know, you could emulsify sand in Crotophos and keep it physically stable. I mean,
I've
it's
had that as
just
part of my sunscreen as well, actually. Unfortunately.
yeah. So, but and the other unique thing about Crotophos, and this was known before we started formulating with it, was it dominates the other ingredients as far as aesthetic feel.
Uh,
So if you put mineral oil in Crotophos, or you put petrolatum in Crotophos, or you put a silicon oil in Crotophos, the feel tends to be exactly the same.
okay.
So you don't have to modify the ingredients to get an aesthetically pleasing product with Crotophos.
So it's been around since the 1990s, but not really used in medical formulations.
That's correct.
And so, what made you decide? Okay, this is the right emulsifier to use for roflumilast.
Basically, it was the only emulsifier we could get a nice, cosmetically elegant, physically stable emulsion
Okay.
um, with the 25% transcutol that we have in our cream product and our
Okay.
foam product for that matter. But we formulate at the same concentration of transcutol as we did in the Axone gel.
Okay.
Right? Because I knew that was well tolerated,
Mm-hmm.
and I knew it was well behaved, and so I just stuck with an old friend when it came to formulating Zoryve. But that much transcutol is really hard to get a good stable emulsion because it tends to want to make a microemulsion. It wants to dissolve the interface. It wants to, make a microemulsion. And so Crotophos was really the only emulsifier robust enough to give us a good, stable cream.
Okay.
And we tried the other ones that were on the inactive ingredient database. Keep in mind, there haven't been a lot of new emulsifiers introduced into prescription products in many years.
Right, so, which is why this is such a big deal. Now, quick question: what's a microemulsion?
A microemulsion is they look more like a gel because they're not white. Okay, the globule size is too small to reflect light.
Gotcha.
And so they have a much different appearance. Now people like to call them nanoemulsions, and it's all part of that nanotech, craze, if you will.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's really interesting, David. You have essentially taken two ingredients that were really well known in the cosmetic space and applied them to the medical space now with transcutol and Crotophos.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of unusual because I only know one other person who's ever gotten a cosmetic ingredient onto the IID, and I'm blanking on his name, but he worked at Galderma. Okay. And when Epiduo Forte was approved, the Cepaniles, which is a new gelling agent, pH-independent gelling agent, much easier to use than Carbapol, was introduced into the IID. And so, but those are the only three new drugs or three new excipients that have, occurred, to my knowledge, in the topical space in the last 40 years.
Now, I know roflumilast has been formulated into a foam, right? And we've used that in seborrheic dermatitis trials, for example. Was Crotophos used in the foam formulation, or was transcutol used in the foam formulation as well?
Yeah, it's I love telling this story because if you're developing a foam, first thing you do is you take the cream, you put it in a can, you crimp on the valve, and you add some propellant, you shake it up, and then you're prepared for disappointment because it never works.
Okay.
Right. With Zoryve, we did that, and it worked. Okay. Wow. Now we got some sputtering. Okay. So that meant that what we call the foam concentrate was too thick. But as soon as we thinned the product down, and for scalp, you don't need a lot of petrolatum. So we reduced the amount of petrolatum and isopropyl palmitate, the moisturizers in the cream formulation. And that allowed us to reduce the amount of Crotophos, right? Because you don't need as much emulsifier if you're not emulsifying as much oil, right? And that's the product. So it's just add propellant. No additional excipients. Just a reduction in the amount of three of the excipients.
And again, no need for propylene glycol again.
No ethanol, no propylene glycol. My first experience with an alcoholic foam was back in the 90s. Did a surgical hand scrub that contained chlorhexidine as the active. And, but those alcoholic foams are really well known. That was the the foam products, but they tend to be drying. And,
they can be. Yep.
And and then the next evolution was to remove the alcohol from the foams and have these moisturizing foams that have recently been introduced with minocycline.
Yeah.
And but our foam is, completely different system because no one else has ever used Crotofos in a NDA foam.
Got it.
Yeah.
So just to give us some insight, David, I'm just thinking about transcutaneous and Crotofos. Now, those were not developed by you or at Dow, for example, or at Arcutis. Those are actually produced by a third-party company that kind of brings them to the market. What are those companies called, and how do you think of them in terms of their place in the industry?
Well, there are suppliers, they are the excipient suppliers, but when you think of Crota,
Mm-hmm.
they make lots. They have hundreds of cosmetic items, right?
Mm-hmm.
Crota's really big. Gafficé is a very old. They've been in existence over 100 years. They originally were doing plant extracts for the French perfume industry. So
Okay.
they'd grow fields of lavender and pick
Ooh.
all the flowers and extract the essential oils and sell them to perfumers. Um, so, these are well-established companies that provide solvents and excipients to pharma.
And so they have their own formulation scientists and chemists who are developing these novel emulsifiers and solvents for the industry.
Uh, yes, although I don't know how many new emulsifiers are being worked on now,
Okay.
because when you know look at the cosmetic industry, you're not really confined for what you put in a cosmetic, and you're not really confined, at least up until a couple of years ago. I'm not totally familiar with the most recent laws for over-the-counter products,
Uh-huh.
but you're not confined in what you put in there. It's really only your personal liability and corporate liability. So people are very conservative, right? Uh, but that's not an FDA requirement. It's just they don't want to get sued. In the old days, when you do an OTC product, all you'd have to do is file what the active was and that you conform to the monograph, and you weren't going to say anything outside the monograph.
Wow.
That was, you didn't even have to put the components,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the only other piece of information you had to put was who the attorneys would contact if a lawsuit was brought against you. Who at the company was responsible to pay if you damage someone.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, and when we're talking about monographs, we're talking about FDA monographed ingredients. Those are those ingredients that have been approved by the FDA to be used in over-the-counter products that do have active abilities to change structure function of the skin. So, for example, if we're talking about acne, we're thinking about salicylic acid or benzoyl peroxide, resorcinol, sulfur. The compounds that you commonly see in the over-the-counter acne space are these FDA monographed ingredients. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about monographs, right, David?
That's correct.
Okay. All right,
Yeah.
great. So I just wanted to we're running a little bit short on time as we always do with these. It's unfortunate. But, when we think about Zoryve, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's striking to me how we have such great non-steroidal topicals like Zoryve, like Vitama, these non-steroidals, but the dermatologic kind of industry really hasn't adopted them to the point where I think they should have. I see these as replacing steroids. I don't think these are the step downs from using a steroid initially to quell the fire and then keeping things under control with these. I really would like to see these being used first line, as I'm sure would the companies. Any insight as to why that prescribing behavior hasn't changed, or what we need to know that maybe that education just isn't being delivered or just not being heard, maybe?
Well, first of all, I absolutely agree with you. I think the split, was like 90% steroids, 10% non-steroidals,
Right.
and that should be reversed.
Yeah,
Now,
absolutely.
there will be the occasional patient where their psoriasis or their inflammatory skin condition is, on a safe spot, and you really need the fire extinguisher. You really need to, because it, for whatever reason, as a clinician, as a physician, you're going to know which patients need Clovex spray, for instance, right?
Yeah.
But that should be the minority of patients. So, I think that there are, in all fields, there are early adopters,
Mm-hmm.
and there are people that will just wait and see.
Yeah.
Right. And, these non-steroidals, these really excellent products, it's still been less than a year.
Right. That's true. We could still think about it as an early adoptive phase to some of these products. I mean, I think what's important for people to realize is that, look, Zoryve is not crisaborole, right? It's a totally different PDE4 inhibitor molecule. The formulation doesn't include propylene glycol at all, whereas the other formulation with the crisaborole does, which may have led to some of the stinging and burning that we've experienced with that drug, and we just don't see with Zoryve. With Vitama, we've got a novel and aryl hydrocarbon receptor agonist. Again, totally new mechanism of action, not seen in dermatology. Elegant formulation as well. Perhaps people are a little bit wary because it's a novel mechanism of action. I'm not sure, but I do think that the word needs to get out that we really need to consider as a specialty to try and move away as much as we can from topical steroids. But I can see, what else would you like to say about that, David?
I'm just absolutely agreeing. And but if I would think that if someone's been in practice a long time, steroids are their old friend, right?
Right.
They've used it successfully, and so.
Changing prescribing habits is difficult. I'm very, very guilty of that in terms of trying to change my prescribing habits. You kind of lean into your old friend in terms of trying to get someone better quickly. And then when you have something new, you've got to trust it, because as physicians, as providers, we need to trust that what we are prescribing is going to work. And so with these novel compounds, you kind of have to gain that trust slowly over time. And maybe that's what we're seeing. It's just kind of that slow uptake in regards to the changing of the practice patterns and the trust that needs to be imbued in these products over time.
If that is true, then we're going to see a really rapid increase in uptake.
Yeah.
Because, you especially with Zoryve, I just know Zoryve. You try it on a handful of patients, you're going to be really pleased with how those patients do. But it will take, 4 to 6 months, maybe before you see them back, before you have that follow-up.
That's true. We're all busy.
And so it hopefully will be a hockey stick for all of us non-steroidal folks in the coming months, and we'll just see, because it's all about patient care.
Absolutely.
You want to do the best for your patients. I want my products to do the best for your patient. We want all products that are doing the best for the patients.
I think that's a great point to end on. So everyone, this is the Skincare Confidential podcast. I am Dr. Ted Lane. We have just had the wonderful experience of interviewing Dr. David Osborne, a formulator, currently the Chief Technical Officer with Arcutis. Prior to that, has worked with Dow and others. Don't forget to download our podcast. Please subscribe. Please share Skincare Confidential with your network as well. We are getting great feedback from our listeners, and we certainly thank everyone for their support. We're doing this out of the goodness of our hearts, really, we just really enjoy it. Patty and I just enjoy this so much, and speaking to great people like David here. So with that, I thank you, and stay tuned for more Skincare Confidential episodes coming every 2 weeks. Thank you.